G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. I'm your host, Ross Coulthart, and I'm very excited to bring you today's story. One thing I love as a journalist is a mystery, especially a mystery that involves Soviet spies, espionage, secret Soviet techniques of technology, all sorts of goings-on with science and UFOs, love, romance, and of course, a swarthy hero. Our hero today is a dashing American Gene Sticco, who's a decorated Bronze Star, no less, US Air Force veteran. Gene's got an illustrious career in intelligence and security. At 19, he was a member of the Presidential Honor Guard in Washington, D.C., and he went on to serve in some of the world's most volatile regions, including Somalia and the Balkans. He was eventually selected for elite duties, working with Special Forces operations, Army Rangers, SEALs, and the toll left him with a 100% disability. But he headed into working as what's euphemistically called a global security expert. He then worked in high-risk operations within corporations like Shell Oil and even Australia's BHP. Then he moved into strategic intelligence and operational planning. And he had a client list there that includes an alphabet soup of three-letter government agencies in the US, including the DoD, the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Department of Energy. Now, this wouldn't be right without a romance. And so along the way, in 2017, he meets a stunningly beautiful woman, Natalja Černohajev. I think I've said that correctly. Shout at me if I haven't, Natalja, who is a celebrated Latvian and now internationally renowned mezzo-soprano opera singer. The swarthy hero is swept off his feet. Cue balalaikas. They fall in love. They marry. They move back to Boston. They have a son. This is such a lovely story. And they even form a local opera company. But this is where it gets interesting. You're all wondering, what's this got to do with UFOs, UAPs? Well, all her life, she's not known much at all about her father, Valerij Černohajev. But I sense, though you think he was a plumber, he was actually quite a humble person. What you didn't know was that he had a very interesting background. It turns out your father was a Soviet aerospace engineer. And as we are about to learn, it may well be the case that he spent decades attempting to reverse engineer what appeared to be UAP, UFO, non-human technology. And I love this part of the story. I love the fact that your little boy, when he was a teenager, had expressed interest in aerospace. And in 2019, shortly before your daddy died, he sent your son a package, a wrapped package. And Natalja, no disrespect to Gene, but I think you need to kick off here. Tell me what happened when you opened the package.
To be honest with you, I was petrified and mesmerized at the same time. So I didn't know how to react, right? Because it was a bunch of scientific formulas at the first glance. But when actually I started to pay close attention, I figured out it's not only formulas, it's lots of drawings. And also when I looked at that more attentively, it looked like flying saucers engineering.
Now, what did you know of your dad's work as a young girl?
All I remember was that when he used to take me to his work, as I mentioned, he used to be a plumber and he used to have multiple sites where he did this work. I remember him having a briefcase, and I remember him always, whenever he had a free minute, he used to work on these materials. But back then I didn't know what kind of materials they were. And what also was amazing that he never used any encyclopedias, he never used any books. It was literally going by memory and just writing whatever came to his mind. So this is what I remember.
Now, Gene, welcome to Reality Check. Let's bring you in now. Tell me about the moment that you saw this extraordinary package that turned up in your home from Valerij, Natalja's father.
So it was, as she said, it was stunning just to begin with, and looking through those first few pages and the math, the physics, and she started reading the first couple of pages, and she's like, he's disputing Einstein's theory of relativity. I'm like, what? Who does that, right? And she's just talking through it, and again, I had only met him maybe 3 times over video before that. All I knew were the stories I got from the wife, the family, smart guy, kind of wasted his life, sad story, never really recovered from the fall of the Soviet Union. And as we're flipping through them, and she's talking about this, I'm torn between, wow, is it, real smart stuff, or, is it sort of his ramblings? And then I got to the drawings of the UFOs. And, as you've seen, there's no denying it. And so I'm asking that, what does this say exactly? And she's like, it's, the technical drawings of the UFO.
And that's the
I'm
thing.
like, and it says UFO, and she's like, yes, it says the saucer, the UFO.
Yeah. So he's saying the UFO. Are you suggesting to me that you believe that he had access to a craft? Do you believe that these are drawings, these are schematics, based on something that he was secretly working on as an engineer?
Yeah, so this we found out actually after his death, because I was never aware of that. I heard some rumors as a kid, but again, I couldn't trust back then because of the political situation in the country. However, after he died, I became close friends with his girlfriend, who was with him actually for a good time before he died. And she actually mentioned that he used to work in the so-called secret zone back in USSR, which was called Priazorsk. And if you want to find a comparison in the United States, it's the so-called Area 51 back there.
Wow.
And I have
so
no idea.
He was working at the Soviet equivalent of Area 51.
Yes. And what's the funniest about that turned out to be that my mom used to actually live with him there.
And
I was never aware.
Never told you about this?
No, never.
Wow.
I mean, she mentioned briefly, but she didn't put emphasis on the fact that it was a closed military base or military city. She just briefly mentioned, oh, he did some very strange refrigerator work there, but she never actually mentioned the exact name of the city. So
what do you know of your father's qualifications? What was he an engineer?
He was an engineer. He graduated from the so-called Riga Institute of Civil Engineering and Civil Aviation, which is now known as Transport and Connection Institute. And back then, it was one of the most famous universities across the USSR. They were 2. There were like one in Kiev and one in Riga, who were famous for actually releasing engineers related to civil aircraft.
When you were a little girl, you don't have any memory of your daddy meeting strange people or having military uniforms or officials around? There was none of that?
That's a very good question. I don't remember particularly military, but I do remember some interesting personalities like the daughter of the French ambassador, if I remember correctly. And we used to hang around at her place. She actually taught me to knit, which I never could do before, right? And I think, if I remember correctly, this is something Gene found out later, that after USSR fell apart, was she the main person who was still connected to the Communist Party of the USSR?
So it was,
she was
a woman that she remembered.
Yeah.
And when I tracked down who this woman was, it turned out during the Soviet period and afterwards, she was essentially the head of the Latvian Communist Party. After independence, she went on to found a international law school there, actually.
So your dad never spoke to you at all, Natalya, about what he did?
No, never. I was always thinking and under impression that he does plumbing. And of course, I had questions as a kid why a person who graduated from this huge university, which pretty much is some sort of MIT, similar to MIT, but back in the USSR and with emphasis on aviation. Of course, I kept on asking, why is he working as a plumber, right? Logically. But he's not the only one. And of course, USSR made corrections after it fell apart to lives of many people. So I was thinking he's just the unhappy person who couldn't find his place under the sun after USSR collapsed and had to do what he had to do just to provide for his family. So that was my understanding of the situation.
Okay, so let's cut to the quick. When you scroll through, and I've got them on a page here in front of me, when you scroll through that manuscript that he sent your son, you see images of a schematic that he or somebody has drawn of what looks like a classic hat-shaped disc flying saucer. The big question, of course, Gene, is this something that he's just doodling in his sketchbook? Or is this something that when you read the documents, and you've now had them translated, that you can reach a conclusion that they were based on something more substantial?
Absolutely. So that became the mission, to understand what exactly these things were. And was it a tabletop hobby? Was it a piece of theoretical work? Or was it exactly what it appeared to be, this engineering of a craft? And I broke that down and chased that down in several ways. Again, I was retired now. You have to understand when this dropped in our laps. And so, I just had to dust off the old skill set and start breaking it down as methodically as I could. And over the course of doing that for the last 4 years, and all the inputs that we got in research and all the rest of it, the language consistently represents that it is based on observation. He does not use any language that it might be anything that would appear to be theoretical. The method and the process that he walks through very much consistently reads as observation, measurement, and explanation. So he's obviously preparing this document, this package, these works for somebody else, for another audience.
One of the images that you've got, and I love it because it's the classic hat-shaped disc UFO. And for the benefit of our editors, it's image 6745. And it seems to have dimensions. What does it show of the size of the object?
So the object's about 30 meters in diameter. It's constructed in two solid pieces, and those pieces operate somewhat independent even of one another. He goes on, he describes a cabin for the pilots, as long with the intricacies of the system, how it, what's inside, how it operates, how it works. But 30 meters overall. And the weight, I don't remember offhand the exact weight of it, but I found that fascinating because it was like the equivalent of 16 fully loaded 747s.
Wow.
So
really?
It was very, very heavy.
And does he talk about the metals that are used to construct the object?
He does. He completely breaks them down. They're silicone-based metal composites. He discusses how those metals then interact with the gravitational and magnetic fields that it creates around them. He discusses how it creates those fields. But the overlying, they are silicone-based alloys.
And I mean, again, everything you're talking about here, the dimensions of the object, the weight of the object, it does suggest that he's doing these schematics based on observation, that this isn't just speculative research where he's designing a fictional UFO.
Well, and it's not only that, and I always remind people, go back to put it in the context of time, the 1980s, through perhaps as late as 2000. So I primarily focus on 80s through 90s, possibly a little bit later, other work being included in it. Those descriptions are very consistent with what comes out from Bob Lazar in the late 80s, early 90s.
It is
that we hear through the late 90s.
Okay, so let's get into some of the detail. But before I do, Natalja, I've got to come back to you here. I mean, I love the fact that you've got this daddy who never let on that he was interested in UFOs. Had he ever talked about UFOs?
The only thing I remember was that he mentioned, right, that UFO is some kind of the way related to religion and God, even though he wasn't that religious, right? And there was one saying which he always repeated, which, if I remember correctly, went like, the God is the time. If you want to understand the God, you have to understand the time, right? And his whole idea was that, UFOs, if I remember correctly, because again, I was little, right, and couldn't understand much from what he was saying anyway, right? So, yes, it's very much about related to consciousness. It's related about with energies, how people think, how people live, right? And yes, Gene can probably talk more because he's more subject matter expert in the papers.
No,
but there is
I'm really glad you mentioned consciousness, because I have a thing about consciousness and UAPs. Did
Correct.
he talk about the importance of consciousness in relation to understanding UAPs, UFOs?
Yes. So there is probably, that's not a secret. So in order to achieve something, you have to believe in that, correct? The whole manifestation theory, I'm not going to, of course, dig deep into this because we are in another show, right? But the whole idea is, right, there is even a theory, I think, was it in the book, right? That when the concentration of people who believe in that much, and then they resonate with the universe, right? Then like the sighting appear, if I remember correctly, right? Mm-hmm. So this is why I think he was, again, going from the perspective of mixing science with religion and explaining it all like with the, like literally with UFO.
Ross, I'm so happy because it seems she really listens to me when I'm talking about this stuff.
Right, because that's what I'm saying. G, like, thank God he's retired, because I have 2 day jobs and my singing career, correct? So this is why, like, he was. But yeah, like, I was paying close attention, and that's what I'm saying. But if you ask me whether he did talk about that, yes, he did. But this is what I remember correctly. He was always about, you have to believe in it.
And if I can just, a couple of things, Nat left out that are fascinating too. There was a point where she found a pass in her father's briefcase to the Duma, the Russian parliament, and thought it was strange a plumber in Latvia would have a pass to the Duma in Moscow. And there were other behavioral clues that, were relayed to us in talking. And again, that came back to memory, like him not living in the dormitory suddenly in university, but going and living in a private apartment. So again, you're talking 1970s, Soviet Union, somebody putting it up in a private apartment. They don't do that for everybody.
So he sent you the manuscript for your son in 2019. And I'm sorry to have to raise sad issues, but how soon afterwards did he pass?
If I remember correctly, a couple of months.
Really?
Yes.
So he probably knew he was dying.
He died actually, was like 30th of December 2000. It's right before COVID. This is what I remember, right? And my understanding of all that was he was very supportive of communism and Soviet Union. And honestly, right, my understanding of this move when he sent it, he probably couldn't find support there. And he still wanted these papers to go public, probably making AG do it, not knowing we would eventually do it. And yes.
And so when he sent you these, did you contact him and say, Dad, what's all this about?
Unfortunately, I didn't have time because we received it like already after he was dead. This is the sad part of the story.
Yeah, so we received them.
Yes,
and at the time we had been living back in the U.S. for under a year, so we had Nat's immigration, AJ's immigration. I think we moved twice, like during a short period. We were in an Airbnb, I think, when he initially sent them. So it was. and it was the holidays. So they sat on the table,
Yes.
Because again, it was something for AJ someday. And it actually was, she had woke up after he had passed. She had woke up one morning, she had a dream about him. It was from that dream that I said, oh, well, where's the stuff he sent? Let's open it. And that's what happened.
We pretty much didn't plan on opening that till AJ probably would turn 18 and went to college, honestly. If it wasn't about the dream, right, that would probably still stay in the warehouse, right?
but the really cool thing about this is, if this is what you suspect it is, your dad looked at a recovered alien spacecraft and has sent your dear son, AJ, the schematics to help him understand how it worked.
This is my understanding right now.
Yeah, I think it was, we struggled with this a little bit as a family, when we made the decision to publish him. As Nat said, he was a diehard communist. Yes. He was sincerely just figured everyone's going to get their stuff together and bring communism back, and he just needed to wait it out. Obviously with my background, we had a lot of laughs.
What did he think about his daughter marrying a? What did his daughter think about his daughter marrying a spook? An American spook.
That's another funny story about him, which I recently remembered. Right, so I came to visit him back in 2016, and back then I wasn't even dating Gene. I didn't know that Gene existed. I was dating absolutely other person. And when I came to visit my dad and this previous boyfriend, he paid for all the trip. The first question my dad asked is like, "How is your CIA guy doing?" I was like, "Which CIA guy? Like the one who paid for this trip?" So I honestly had a vibe. My dad is crazy because I said, honestly, my previous boyfriend didn't have anything to do with CIA, right? But that was such a funny coincidence. So could he read the future? Because I treated him as, Dad is joking, and it's another dirty joke by Dad or whatever it is, but fact is fact. Somehow back then.
Do you think it's fair to say, Natalja, he probably didn't tell you about the work that he'd done to protect you?
I assume so. And I assume there is also the so-called secret clearance or whatever it's called here. And I assume some kind of a similar situation is back in USSR. Because one of my Noni's brothers, he also worked in a closed military facility. And as far as I'm aware, he still can't leave Russia at all. So that's a real thing there. Some of the people, they can't even go visit a neighbor.
And his dad's girlfriend in a recent catch up with her was talking about how he was under surveillance by the FSB for a period of time too.
Because my mom was thinking he's crazy, right? I don't remember him being under surveillance because he didn't talk to me about that. But his girlfriend confirmed he was, and she saw it with her own eyes. So that means my mom was just not being very transparent. Or some people, they prefer not to, or they pretend to not see it, right? Just to protect themselves, because it's easier to live like that. The less you know, the better you sleep, as we say in Russian.
Now, I love this story that he left it for AJ, your teenage son. And he's apparently genuinely interested in aerospace technology, so maybe it runs in the family.
I think so, because initially he wanted to fly, and now he's switching into maybe going and becoming an engineer. So that's it. So there's a shift in his mind.
That brings us to the next question for you, Gene. Obviously, you've now done the work as an intelligence analyst, going in and trying to make an assessment of these documents. One of the things that I think is really interesting is in the time since you've written your book, Engineering Infinity, which is a website, correct me if I'm wrong, it's engineeringinfinity.com, is that correct?
Engineerininfinitybook.com.
Engineerininfinitybook.com. So anyone can go and have a look at the book and see the translation of the manuscript that Gene's very kindly organized. It's fascinating because I read the whole thing through, and I've spoken to, how does one say this politely, a few people who have an awareness of the program, the covert program that's being operated inside America. And a couple of them weren't even aware of your attempt to put this book into the public domain, but they were certainly aware of the Russian work, the Soviet work on alleged retrieved non-human craft. And what fascinates me is their reaction. They were very interested to engage with what you've published. What have you found, Gene? Like, what conclusions can we come to? We know, for example, that in the last few months, George Knapp, our fellow journalist George Knapp, was very good in bringing forward the Thread 3 documents, which are Soviet-era documents which George was given by former Soviet scientists from the former Soviet Union. He bravely smuggled them out of the former Soviet Union, brought them into the United States, shared them with Robert Bigelow and his team that were doing work with various American intelligence agencies. And those documents, in the main, until very recently, haven't been released. I think there's about 25 pages in what George put into Congress, but apparently there's several hundred pages in what George actually put as an exhibit before Congress. There's some disparity between what George actually tabled and what has now been made public. But what conclusions have you been able to reach, Gene, based on looking at what George was able to obtain from Soviet-era scientists about the Russian UFO program and what Valerij Černohajev was able to find in his sketches?
What George produced was, for me, in many ways, a holy grail. I mean, it was a link that really solidified in my mind, if there, in intelligence, we speak in terms of confidence, and I always had medium to high confidence in the authenticity of the project as being the reverse engineering of a UFO. With the Thread 3 documents, that went to high confidence because they specifically are, I should reframe that. My father-in-law's work is a specific work product of those orders. And so
just explain that to me. Why do you say they're connected? Why do you say you can see links between the Thread 3 documents that George got from the former Soviet Union and what Valerij, Natalya's dad, had in his notebooks?
Sure. So within the Thread 3 orders, and it breaks down the program itself, where it's the military component and then the civilian component. The civilian component involves about 5 agencies, primarily academic institutions, I should say, that each have a different level of expertise. A couple of those organizations are actually organizations that were in Priazerk. So the process to bring through to everybody was the Russians went forward with this plan to establish the anomalous aerial phenomenon study. The military would retrieve materials and conduct interviews. It would then dispatch to whichever appropriate institution if it was more atmospherically related, communication signal related, materials related. They would filter those materials to an institution for study and engineering. And then there was to be a body of engineering work. Further within the orders, it talks about not specifically craft, but speaks in terms of materials, of propulsion, of I think at one point it even mentions the solenoids. So there are parameters within those orders that say, by this order we will study these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things. And my father-in-law's work are those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things when it directly relates to, materials, let's say, because, I think this is part of the problem even in U.S. and disclosure. You're not going to find a big file with, a giant UFO stuff written on it. the language is always going to be massaged and carefully crafted in how they do that.
But let's deal with some specifics. For example, in the Černohajev manuscript, Engineering Infinity, that you've put into the book called Engineering Infinity, there's a system blueprint for a pulsed reactor which has MHD, which I presume is a magneto-hydrodynamic drive. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And what's a MEG takeoff solenoid arrays? What's a MEG, MEG?
I believe that's magnetic. Yeah, if we're talking about the Polaroid arrays, then it's the magnetic aspect of that.
Energy generator or something?
Right. So the craft he describes basically operates. It manipulates and then creates its own field to live and operate in by manipulating gravity and magnetism of the planets, the bodies that it's operating in.
Correct. There is, I think, the whole section which actually described the different gravitational parameters of different planets. Right. This is why we found out probably how it is connected.
Right. So it creates these fields. Within the craft itself, it uses a solenoid array. Mm-hmm. That solenoid array is powered by electricity that is generated through a compact thermonuclear system mm-hmm. that converts heavy water, deuterium to plasma to create the electricity, to power the solenoids, to create the magnetic fields.
And remember, neither of our physicists.
And I am not full scientific disclosure, if you haven't guessed by now.
I used to have a physics back in the university, but that was not that much to understand all that. But Gene did a phenomenal job.
No worries. But the thing that I find fascinating is you've also, Gene, gone in and looked at Russian patents. And there are patents which disclose buildable magneto-hydrodynamic power takeoff plans, plasma propulsion modules, field thrust, and there's even some patents that talk about an integrated vehicle with MHD, magneto-hydrodynamics. So essentially the propulsion system you believe is this plasma magneto-hydrodynamics that Valerij was exploring, which is also reflected in the patents that you've discovered from that era.
Exactly. Again, from the Intel investigative background, I look at this book as a resource. It's a timestamp. It is a utility to all things anomalous aircraft, aerial phenomenon. And not only did I find, and what led to all that was really the idea of FOIA requests. And hearing the stories and the challenges when people investigating this put in FOIA. And it was literally about 2 a.m. one morning, I woke up with this revelation, an epiphany, if you will. I said, well, what if we just don't ask about UFOs and UAPs anymore? Because here we have this consistent body of work that's describing the reverse engineering of a UFO. Let's just ask about the science. Mm-hmm. And so I started down this path of extracting the core scientific domains and then seeing what was out there. And what was out there led directly to patents, not only from Russia, but from the United States as well.
Now that's the cool part.
It led to programs and all the rest. I hope I didn't get ahead of you, but it started with the patents. And some of them came to me from outside people who looked at it and they said, this looks a lot like this. And we started comparing it and saying, yeah, it does.
So let's just get to that, because as well as the Russian patents for magneto-hydrodynamics, MHD, you also discovered the Americans at pretty much the same timeline were looking at patents for extreme plasma compression, propellantless electromagnetic drive architectures, aneutronic fusion concepts, inertial control, which are all very similar to what the Russian papers were talking about and Valerij's manuscript.
Right. As Nat said, I'm not a scientist, but I know patterns. That's always been the strength. And that's what I began to see developing. And there is there's certainly an argument to be made, and it might be one that comes right to top of mind of anybody hearing, this story for the first time, that science that's existed for a long time. It existed before Chernohajev was born. What makes it compelling is when you put it together. It's one thing to study a scientific topic in isolation. It becomes another thing when you pair it with a second topic, a third topic, a fourth topic, and when those topics are then replicated throughout another system. So replicated throughout the Russian system, replicated throughout the US system. You begin to strip away coincidence and parallel science and hot topic of the day. When you look at how the three each attempt to relate these topics to one another, and it's all in a very specific, consistent way.
So, Natalja, I know from what George Knapp talked about in the fall of the Soviet Union, when George was over there were Soviet scientists falling over themselves to share secrets with the West. But your dad, as Gene has said, was obviously a very committed communist and still very much a believer in the old system. Were there colleagues of his, though, workmates, that you've been able to make contact with? Is there anyone that he worked with that you've been able to speak to who has confirmed your father's secret work with the former Soviet Union as an aerospace engineer?
That's a very good point. Unfortunately not. And I assume that was the part of him protecting me from knowing too much. This is my guess.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if there is anybody watching this who knows anything about the Soviet program, and I know there are a few people who are experts. I've spoken to a few of them. I'd love to hear from anyone who knows anything about this Soviet program who might be able to help us piece together this mystery. And the best thing to do would be to go to the engineeringinfinitybook.com website that Gene's put together and look at the paperwork that's there for the manuscript that Valerij has put together and see whether there are any names that might be associated with that work, because it would be great, wouldn't it, to get corroboration of your father's secret work.
This is why Gene put it out there again, right? He's a genius, the genius, sorry. He put it together. Right. We put it out for the world to decide. And my belief, again, whatever you believe in, is finding the people who will find it interesting, who will find it applicable to what they are doing. Because so far we have been getting feedback, and I can't name the organization, that one particular part of that solved an issue they haven't been able to solve for a bunch of years. So that's already promising because, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we didn't know whether it was, again, just something he made up or whether it's something he actually observed, right? And this feedback we have started getting means that there is valuable stuff inside. So that's why.
Yeah, and that's why we released it in the way
we
did, because, I was trying to think, well, do I write a story about it? And just so, and I'm like, listen, we don't have the expertise to do that. So let's do the best we can on a translation and put it out there with the invitation. And I appreciate that call out.
Yes.
Because that's what I hoped would happen. I said, somebody somewhere may recognize this, whether it's work their father or grandfather did, whether it's something they worked on. I didn't have particularly much hope of it going too deep into Russia or Kazakhstan, but we're certainly getting hits. And like with anything, somebody out there will recognize or know something that, everything's another piece to the puzzle.
So Natalja hinted there that there are agencies, presumably three-letter agencies somewhere in the US government, that have taken a close interest in the manuscript. What are you able to tell me, Gene, of what they've adduced from what they've read? I mean, Natalja hinted there that there were things that were actually potentially quite useful to their understanding of what the Soviets were up to.
Well, so it wasn't a three-letter agency. It was actually a private company that studies advanced propulsion.
Yeah, we just can't name the company, unfortunately. Yes.
Okay, no worries.
So, not only there was another author as well who was doing his own research on UFO engineering and sent me a bunch of materials after he went through the book, and he said, "I think this is the craft that's famously related to Kapustin Yar." In the former Soviet Union.
Wow! So let's before our audience lose that, Kapustin Yar is a very famous name in the former Soviet Union. That's a secret, wasn't it? A rocket launch facility?
Correct. So it's all part of with Priazerk, Kapustin Yar are all sort of part of the same network of facilities that sit from like approximately St. Petersburg. And then when it was the former Soviet Union into Kazakhstan, around there's a lake that begins with a B.
Baikal, no.
Well, Baikonur, the Cosmodrome.
Baikal, no, the lake, no.
Oh yeah, Baikal. Yeah. Thank you.
Which has, by the way, one of the most amazing entity alien sightings. There's an amazing story about Lake Baikal, but I won't get into that right now.
It's all the same neighborhood relatively. Yeah. Where and as well as those facilities are at least publicly very well known for their missile research, ICBM, explosives, as well as the UFO lore. But obviously on the surface, it's supposed to be. I was leaked
a document from inside American defense, not a classified document, I hasten to add, which talked about Mount Yamantau. Have you ever heard of Mount Yamantau?
I have, yeah.
You know better. You're the subject matter aspect.
I don't know the whole story, but I know there was a suspected base of or alien portal or base or NHI that were spotted in the mountains. It's sort of part of the local legend.
Yeah, it's also allegedly the location for a secret Russian military facility where they're allegedly working with recovered non-human technology. I'm just wondering if that name came up in Valerj's documents at all, Mount Yamantau.
No, he never. He never mentions anything specific as far as locations. He never, discusses the origins of what it is that he's working on. The only clue that we have in there, it was one of the first ones that jumped out at me when it came to, is this official research of some kind? There is a point where 2 times he references previous work that he's written and submitted to the Russian Duma.
Wow. So this was going to the Russian parliament.
Yes.
Well, whoever was reading it, so that's why I say, he's explaining to somebody else in a portion of that document. He says, to the degree effect of reference this paper submitted to Duma of Russia, 1991 to 1997. And so there's 2 references like that, which again says to me, whoever this is being written for also has access to the previous papers submitted to the Duma. And if we contextualize once more, not everybody's walking into the Duma asking for old papers and able to get them.
Now, the really interesting thing about this period of history, the fall of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and in those very early years in the 1990s, there really was quite a lot of collaboration between the United States and scientists from the former Soviet Union, not just in disarmament, getting rid of some of the nuclear weapons, but also on some of the scientific programs that had taken place. And I sense there's still a lot of secrecy, even inside the US, about just what the Russians were up to, the Soviet Union was up to, because I suspect the US already knows a lot of what Valerij Černohajev's manuscript reveals. Is that your impression?
I suspect so too. Like I said, this is a good time marker. It's a good timestamp, because not only have I gone from the 80s to 2025, I've looked backwards before the 1980s as these scientific domains developed, and when did they take hold. And there's an interesting period in particular I've just been sort of diving into over the last week or so, that involves a period post-Roswell through the 1970s. And in the 1970s, you have programs that were endorsed by the U.S., came per the order of Nixon, where we have U.S. contractors working in the USSR on magnetohydrodynamic energy.
Exactly. I wonder sometimes whether there isn't one of the explanations for the secrecy that a lot of people say to me, why hasn't Putin gone public with what he knows about NHI? I suspect there is or has been collaboration between the former Soviet Union and the United States, and I suspect it's still ongoing, believe it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. When I looked at the Thread 3 documents and those orders that established this organization, that said something to me, that the Russians looked at the UFO problem as an external problem, as a true unknown anomalous phenomenon. They knew it was not the United States, but we took a different approach, where we had these programs developed and used the cover of ICBM, and we don't know where it's coming from. Could be the Russians, could be the Chinese, could be. The Russians seem to definitively know it wasn't their enemy. So I think a lot of the things, the institutions and actions that the U.S. government took in using the USSR, even now Russia, as the enemy, that we don't know what their technology might be, is specifically designed that way. It's easy to bury under the national security umbrella. There are obviously, even right in my father-in-law's design, nuclear components. Throw that under DOE. The compartmentalization plus the decades of this happening, where institutional memory of the origins has faded, and the science has just taken on a life of its own. It provides that perfect environment. And my bringing this out isn't to risk any of that, but to say, if we are serious about disclosure, if our legislators are serious about disclosure, this is actually a roadmap to get there that gives you specific parameters and guide rails to operate within. And you can filter out the true national security things and focus on the things that answer the questions that humanity's looking for.
Have you had any interest at all, any approaches from any government agencies in response to what you've put up online?
I had the FBI show up on weekend.
That's interesting.
I call it more of a fishing expedition than anything direct. During the period of time, I noticed a lot of, let's say, intelligence community adjacent analytics, all from the back office of website and social media and things like that. Again, I have the background to understand some of this. I have a Russian bride who has a master's degree in IT engineering. We know, how to look at the back office and see where traffic is coming from and how it's all interconnected.
So what you're talking about here is you're seeing ISP addresses that appear to have intelligence community connections.
They are adjacent to areas where there is a presence and a concentration of IC and advanced aerospace agencies, and the numbers at which those hits come relative to the other traffic is disproportionate to what it would be for a casual user.
And they want you to know that they are watching, because otherwise they would use a VPN, obviously, right? Because I think you had even one hit from Vatican.
Yeah, I have one hit every now and then from Vatican City, which I've been told is a friend.
So, Natalja, can I ask, Natalja, was your dad disappointed as an ardent communist? Was he disappointed that his beautiful daughter had gone over to the American side? Or do you get the feeling that when he sent this bundle of documents, it was largely out of a sense of desperation? He wanted them.
I believe you are correct in terms of desperation, because I think he felt himself neglected. This is how I feel about what and why has happened after. So what was the reason behind all that? And honestly, I think maybe he knew about the Ukrainian invasion, and I don't think he would support that among us, because he was he was about the peace, about not having any wars, right? So this is what I assume from his perspective. He thought that would be better for me instead of going to Russia, because that's another fact of my biography. So when I turned 16, I believe, I had to choose citizenship, because my mother, she is a Latvian citizen, father was a Russian citizen. So I had to choose. And already back then I could choose Russian, right? But I never did it. And what I remember now very clearly, my dad approved the choice of Latvian citizenship. So this still keeps on circling in my mind whether he knew what would happen. Because what's happening now in Latvia, it's not something he would want me to be part of, right? And in Russia as well, right? So that's why I feel a little bit that he could read the future. Not being that crazy yet, but this I remember correctly. Yeah, very, very clear. He did it because I was expecting he would blow all up, right? And just, why did you take Latvian citizen? But no, he was very supportive of this choice.
And I'm a treasured dad's love anyway.
Right, true.
But you're a dastardly American. So
That's
tell me this, Gene. Where do you want to go with this? Like, what's your aspiration with these documents? You've got this amazing manuscript that really does. I mean, he talks about the UFO in a way that suggests very strongly he had access to a craft. We can't say definitively, but what I do find interesting is you accurately point out in your analysis that whatever this document is recording, what's interesting is the Americans appear to be monitoring the same technology and adopting countermeasures to it as well. Explain that to me. Explain what you've described there and what you've seen there.
Right. So along with, did they explore the same issues? And, I've found, yes, not only they explored, there are actually contracts out now in the SAM system, the government contracting system, that I could submit an answer and a proposal to these contracts from DARPA based solely upon my father-in-law's work, and probably have a good chance of winning the contracts. The other aspect of what I did was to ask myself the question, and part of coming forward was I also hear what's coming out of Russia. Putin specifically saying, we are pursuing weapons using new physical principles. They talk about EMP, plasma-based weapons, all of these things, which all echo and have hallmarks and in some ways mirror the derivatives and types of technology that are in my father-in-law's work. And so I sort of asked myself the question in trying to assess the U.S. position and U.S. policy on this, because it's either we know in they're friendly, we don't know what the intentions are, or we know there are potentially bad intentions. And so I researched the question, if we take this craft and look at how it operates, do we have any systems that can counter how this craft operates? And I not only found there were about 7 specific programs that would specifically counter and cause this be able to disrupt this type of craft. But I also began to see a pattern around some of the old U.S. nuclear facilities, where there was manipulation of the environment of the ground. And as we all know, you've done this spots on it, the relationship of interest of UFOs to the nuclear facilities. And I'm looking at one case right now at a deactivated site that used to have nukes, where people have found large parts of the landscape, let's say, manipulated. And my hypothesis is, did the military recognize this early on, that these craft operate by manipulating magnetic fields, and did they intentionally also, did the government manipulate the landscape around these areas in order to try and dampen the optimization of the craft as a way to make them not able to operate in those areas? So it seems, yes, very much there are systems in place to counter at least the type of craft that's described in my father-in-law's work.
Now, you've had people who do have physics qualifications, advanced physics qualifications and engineering qualifications, look at these blueprints, these schematics. I'm particularly interested, for example, in some of the detail from Černohajev's design. For example, he has a complete fusion reactor specification using a so-called chlorine lithium-6 2 helium-4 reaction. And you point out it's chosen specifically because it produces no neutrons or beta radiation, which is perfect for spacecraft. To your knowledge, is there anyone that you know from science who says that things like this are even technically feasible? I mean, people can write things down in a notebook, schematics, but are they actually scientifically achievable? I know fusion, we're very close to fusion at the moment in science, but we're not quite there yet. Is there anybody that you've spoken to who's said that any of these schematics, any of these engineering drawings are in fact reflecting solid science?
So I've had a number of people with physics background who have come forward, and it's been a consistent reaction. They come in sort of very confident, and after a while they step back and they say, this is really dense. This is really, this is more than I thought it was going to be. It's much deeper. I've had feedback in the sense that somebody who is, again, a nuclear physicist looked at it and said, this is something with $40 million, we could build the facility that would be needed to build the tools to test this. So for the ones who really take the time, now I've had plenty just dismiss it. That's the common reaction. But I've had enough of the people who have dove into it and spent time in it who come back with that, wow, this is really dense. And, I think maybe.
I think the thing that really struck me is that when you went through what Černohajev described in his notebooks, for every exotic capability that he describes, you point out there's a corresponding US defensive capability that's either been developed or is being developed. And for example, transmedium vehicles that operate through air, water, and space. And it looks like Arrow is very focused on that as well. Electronic warfare, electromagnetic propulsion requiring precise field control. And the US response is electromagnetic environmental effects program with a sophisticated radio frequency interference capability. Directed energy weapons. The Černohajev documents talk about plasma containment and electromagnetic field systems. And you point out that even in the open source, there's US research talking about high-powered electromagnetic pulse weapons and directed energy research. It's interesting, isn't it, that the US is quietly working on much of what Chernohajev was talking about.
Isn't there an old saying, Ross? The best place to hide something's right out in the open.
Absolutely. No,
You know,
it's frustrating though, because in the notebooks, and Natalya, I think you'd concur on this, in any of these notebooks, they're all your dad's writing. It's not, there's no Soviet documents, government documents. He's been careful not to pilfer or include documents in his
That's
file.
very correct. And
Yeah.
there is also a method how he classifies the papers. And Jean can talk more about that because I was clueless, right? That was another indication that this. So my dad had connected with certain institutions back in USSR. Jean explained the whole classification of the papers based on the colors and.
no.
No.
So
Sorry, I'm making him work.
What I say is, in again trying
Because
to
it's a good thing. Sorry.
trying to authenticate and kind of give myself the idea and the parameter of where this fell in. I looked very carefully at the structures of the paper. So the way he uses headings and the numbering systems and all of that is, again, very consistent with what was done during the time period in both government and academic work. One of the interesting things was the very first piece of paper is a pinkish red piece of paper. And that was something that was used within the classification system because the security folks didn't necessarily know by subject what was classified and what wasn't. So they would use a cover sheet that had a specific color. And if they knew if it was coordinated with a badge or with your position, they knew it was okay for you to have that. And, that was somewhat validated again by George Knapp when he talked about, how to get him out of the country. Well, he just took off the top piece of paper and threw it away.
So you think the pink paper, which is a blank piece of pink paper, that's indicative that this notebook was a sensitive document?
Absolutely. And if you'll notice, some of the pages are bluish. The entire page is blue ink, which indicates that it is a carbon copy. We all remember we're close to being gentlemen of the same time period when carbon paper reigned. So who knows where the original went? And when we speak in terms of the Thread 3 documents, I'm sure this is one piece of a much, much larger piece of work, body of work. I'm sure a lot more came out of Thread 3 than this.
It's interesting because I only realized this week because I sent a colleague, I think, 25 pages from the Thread 3 documents that have been made public from what George tabled in Congress. But George has confirmed to me and to other people that, in fact, the documents that he brought to Congress and tabled involved several hundred pages of documents. And at the moment, not all of those pages have been tabled before Congress, which I find concerning and fascinating. I mean, George obviously tabled them with the intention of making them public. I'd certainly like to see the full extent of the documents and make a comparison between them and what Valerij Černohajev himself wrote in his notebook. Gosh, there's more questions than answers here, aren't there? There's a lot more digging to be done.
Oh, absolutely. And early on in this process, I mean, again, we had a full 4 years of sitting on this, of investigating, and throughout then and even up until last month, there is nothing in the world I would love more than to have a 20-30 minute conversation with George. I know he has the documents. I've sent them to him several times. And to again, I was hoping to do it before the idea of releasing them came forward. I reached out to universities. You'd be surprised how hard it is to find a Russian speaking physicist who understands cosmology and everything else as well. right here, in the Boston area.
Which is supposed to be very easy, right?
My full intent, those 4 years I spent trying to find somebody to hand these to.
Yes, you didn't want to even run with that. You didn't want to dig.
No,
yeah.
I mean, this is the thing, and it's only it's the contradiction of people who we did meet who could give an informed opinion on them to some degree, whether it was on the language, on the science, on the subject matter itself of what was going on in the UAP community. None of this I had awareness of prior to really June of this year. Even you, Ross, I didn't know who you were until June of this year.
I didn't know who George Knapp was until I found a very funny video, which I filmed from the TV back in 2021. It was George Knapp showing a video back from Latvia. I think it was 1950 something, and I just filmed it because it was Latvia. Right. I had no idea it was George Knapp, I swear. And no idea.
So, so the idea, he was somebody that seemed to have hundreds of pages of these documents, and I could say, well, here's what I've got. What do you think? Or, where to send these or what to do with these. Nobody would know I exist. But that never happened. I got the feeling in a lot of ways, not just George, but a number of people were going out of their way to not have a conversation with me about any of this. And again, from my old world and my old background, that just makes me ask more questions. And we are where we are now.
Well, I hope somebody watching this is going to come forward with a useful tidbit of information. And Natalja, I can't help but wonder whether your dad, in desperation, sent these documents to your young teenage son in the hope that one day he might build the very craft that he describes in those schematics and do the breakthrough as a young aerospace engineer that he wasn't able to do under the disintegrating Soviet Union. It's a beautiful story, fascinating story, and I thank both of you for bringing it to me, and I sincerely hope that if anyone out there has any information that might help us shed more light on Valerij Černohajev's manuscripts and the thread-free documents, we would love to hear more about what was going on in Soviet-era UAP retrieval and reverse engineering programs. Gene Sticco and Natalja Černohajeva-Sticco, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ross. I appreciate it.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And before we go, please don't forget we do our weekly question and answer, and we need your questions. So please send your questions in by email to realitycheck@newsnationnow.com. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.